I always knew I shouldn't look at Marcus Hayes, my ethics professor's husband, the way I did. But when he leaned in, smelling faintly of wet wool and expensive cologne, he whispered a secret that felt like a match dropped onto gasoline. We were on the stone steps outside the library annex, the air thick and chilled after the sudden downpour, the sound of water rushing down the drains, the only noise louder than my own frantic heartbeat. He didn't look at me, just straight ahead at the flooded quad, but his hand rested on the step between us, dangerously close to mine. "I watch you when you don't know I'm looking, Eliza," he said, his voice low and gritty, cutting through the heavy post-rain silence. "I have for months." My life in Crestview was organized around the predictable rhythm of semesters and the scent of old paper. I wasn't a student anymore. I was a research assistant in the history department, tucked away in the least glamorous wing of the university. Eliza Hayes. Not related to the Marcus Hayes or the famed Professor Vivian Hayes. The connection was purely coincidental, and one I often felt compelled to mention to avoid awkward assumptions. I was 28, and my existence was quiet, almost deliberately so. I lived in a tiny, overpriced apartment a 15-minute walk from campus, my evenings usually consisting of microwaving leftovers, grading papers for Professor Schmidt, my official boss, a kind man who spoke mostly in footnotes, and scrolling through Instagram photos of lives far more vibrant than my own. I hadn't been chosen for anything significant in a long time. Not for a big promotion, not for a serious relationship, not even for the exciting coffee runs. I was the reliable one, the background fixture, the person who made sure the system worked smoothly without drawing attention to herself. I wore practical shoes. My hair was usually pulled back in a loose bun, and my clothes were the color of mild anxiety, neutrals and muted blues. It was comfortable, this invisibility. It meant fewer risks, fewer potential hurts. I had spent my early 20s getting hurt, and I had promised myself a long, boring rest. This Tuesday was proving to be a perfect execution of the plan. I spent 8 hours deep in the archive basement, surrounded by climate-controlled boxes of 19th-century ledgers, my only company the faint hum of the dehumidifier. My lunch was eaten quickly at my desk, a sad, lukewarm pasta salad, while I proofread a doctoral thesis on the economic impact of railway construction. When I finally emerged, blinking against the late afternoon sun, the world felt too bright, too loud. I needed to drop off a sensitive document at the administrative building before the closing bell rang at 5:00 p.m. It was 4:45 p.m. I walked quickly, my briefcase tucked tightly under my arm, focusing only on the crack in the sidewalk 3 feet ahead of me. I certainly wasn't thinking about the Hayeses, despite the fact that Professor Vivian Hayes' office was on the second floor of the building I was entering. She was brilliant, elegant, intimidatingly perfect, and Marcus Hayes, her husband, was the silent, powerful force often seen entering the building in perfectly tailored suits. He ran some high-profile private equity firm downtown, but somehow still managed to pick up his wife for dinner most nights. They were the university's power couple, the gold standard of success and mutual admiration. And I was Eliza, carrying a manila envelope, hoping the copier didn't jam tomorrow. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, ready for the quick, painless transaction that would signal the end of my workday. The only surprise I anticipated was heavy traffic on the route home. The idea that something extraordinary, or even mildly inconvenient, would happen to me, here, now, was simply beyond the scope of my expectation management. My expectations were low, secure, and wonderfully uneventful. The administrative assistant, Sandra, was already closing down her computer when I arrived at the front desk. I handed her the sealed envelope, feeling the satisfying release of a completed task. "Thanks, Eliza. Professor Schmidt owes you big time for this." "Just doing my job," I murmured, already turning to leave. That's when the sky decided to interfere with my neat schedule. The administrative building lobby, usually bathed in the soft glow of interior lighting, suddenly dimmed. A loud, aggressive drumming started against the plate glass windows. Rain. Not just rain, but a sudden, violent, end-of-days downpour typical of Crestview in late spring. The kind of rain that turns sidewalks into shallow rivers within minutes. I sighed, pulling my phone out to check the weather app, which, predictably, hadn't warned me. My umbrella was safely tucked away in my apartment closet. I hated being stranded. I hated anything that disrupted the smooth transition from work self to home self. Sandra looked up from her desk. "Oh, wow. That escalated quickly. You're not walking in that, are you?" I glanced at the torrential sheets outside, which made the row of parked cars look blurry and distorted. "I really need to get home," I admitted, trying to sound resigned rather than annoyed. "Maybe it'll pass in 10 minutes. "It looks like a 45-minute soaker, sweetie. Why don't you wait in the faculty lounge? There's coffee, and maybe a leftover cookie from this morning's alumni meet." Sandra pointed to a discreet door tucked near the emergency exit. "I have to lock up the main desk, but you're welcome to wait until it slows down." I hesitated. The faculty lounge felt like sacred, untouchable territory. It was where the tenured elite discussed grants and publications, not where research assistants waited out the weather. But standing in the lobby felt awkward, and getting soaked felt worse. "Are you sure?" "Go on," she insisted, shooing me gently. "Just don't touch Professor Sinclair's artisanal cheese plate. He gets territorial." It was such a trivial decision, a choice between momentary discomfort and soaking my one decent work blazer. I wasn't accepting a date or signing a contract. I was accepting temporary shelter. Pure circumstance. I pushed the door open, slipping inside the warm, wood-paneled room. The lounge was mostly empty, smelling faintly of stale coffee and expensive wood polish. A large, dark window dominated the far wall, providing a spectacular, if miserable, view of the flooded quad outside. I went straight for the sad-looking coffee machine, pouring myself a half cup, more for the warmth than the caffeine. I settled onto a slightly worn leather armchair, pulling my briefcase close, ready to spend the next hour staring blankly at my phone until the weather decided to respect my commute schedule. This was not an adventure. This was a delay. A very damp, very boring delay. I told myself to be grateful for the dry air and the relative quiet. I just wanted the day to end. I was about 3 minutes into my deliberate phone-staring routine when the door to the lounge opened again. I barely glanced up, assuming it was Sandra grabbing a bottle of water before she finished closing up the building. But the presence that entered the room was different, heavier, quieter, taking up more space than Sandra ever would. I knew immediately who it was. Marcus Hayes. He wasn't wearing the tailored suit I usually saw him in when he picked up Professor Hayes. Today, he was in charcoal trousers and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong wrists and a silver watch. He carried a slightly damp trench coat slung over his shoulder, a clear indicator that he'd been caught in the downpour too, though he looked annoyingly unruffled by it. His dark hair was meticulously styled, but a few strands were plastered to his forehead from the humidity, giving him a look of casual, almost rough elegance. He was the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure in the room shift. He commanded a sphere of influence far beyond the academic halls of Crestview University. He sat on corporate boards, donated endowments, and, perhaps most relevantly to my current internal state, he was married to one of the most respected minds in the state. He existed on a completely different stratum. He didn't notice me right away, or perhaps he just didn't register me. I sank a little deeper into the leather armchair, trying to become part of the room's texture. He walked over to the windows, his movements economical and purposeful, and simply stood there, looking out at the rain-lashed quad. His posture spoke volumes, controlled, contained, shoulders subtly slumped only by the weight of a long day, not by weakness. I watched him discreetly over the rim of my coffee cup. He had a strong profile, the kind of sharp jawline that looked carved from something harder than bone. He wasn't conventionally handsome in a Hollywood way. He was striking in a way that suggested competence and unyielding focus. He stayed by the window for a minute, silent, absorbing the storm. Then, without turning, he spoke. "I was hoping the rain would hold off until I got to the car," he said, his voice deep and measured. It wasn't a question directed at me, but a simple statement of fact, tossed into the shared space. I realized he must have noticed me after all. I straightened up slightly, clearing my throat. "It hit very fast," I managed, feeling my cheeks warm slightly. It felt incredibly strange to be sharing this small, confined space with him. He was Professor Hayes's husband, a man who dealt with millions of dollars before breakfast, and I was just Eliza, grading papers in a quiet corner. He didn't belong in my orbit, not even during a rogue thunderstorm. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet, but in status and expectation. He was the thunder, and I was the damp pavement. Marcus finally turned from the window, his gaze sweeping across the room. When his eyes landed on me, they paused. It wasn't a searching look, nor was it a look of recognition. Not exactly. It was an acknowledgement of presence, which, coming from him, felt like an intense investigation. He walked past the central mahogany table and chose the armchair opposite mine, settling into it with a sigh that seemed too deep for the simple act of sitting. His expression was carefully neutral, but the corners of his mouth were pulled down slightly, betraying a flicker of exhaustion. "You're Eliza, aren't you?" he asked. "Not Professor Hayes's assistant, not Schmidt's RA, just Eliza." My heart gave a sharp, nervous thump against my ribs. It was one thing to be recognized by his wife, who signed my paychecks, indirectly. It was another for him to know my name. "Yes, Mr. Hayes. Eliza Hayes." I added the surname automatically, the useless coincidence. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't offer the usual small talk, the questions about my research or the university budget. He just looked at me, his deep-set eyes unnervingly direct. The silence that followed wasn't polite. It was weighted. It felt like a decision was being made, or maybe a boundary was being tested. I fiddled with the strap of my briefcase, suddenly intensely aware of how plain and worn my clothes were compared to the quiet confidence of his attire. "You spend a lot of time here," he observed, still watching me. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "I work here, in the archives. I was just delivering something to administration." "No, I mean, on the grounds. I see you often. Walking across the quad in the mornings, sometimes late in the evenings, always focused on where you're going." My brow furrowed slightly. This was the moment the tension snapped the normal conversational rhythm. How did he know that? He was a busy CEO. His wife was a celebrated academic. Why would he notice my solitary, focused walks? Was he implying I loitered? Was he just making conversation and I was overanalyzing every syllable? "I live close by," I explained, feeling a defensiveness rise. "It's just my route home." He didn't acknowledge the explanation. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely. The gesture was intimate, drawing my attention to the fine lines around his eyes. He looked tired, genuinely weary, but not weak. "You seem like you know how to be alone, Eliza," he said, his voice dropping slightly, making it feel like a secret rather than an observation. The comment was so profoundly personal, so far outside the bounds of appropriate small talk, that it knocked the air out of my lungs. It wasn't accusatory, but it was incredibly insightful. It felt like he had peered into the quiet, protected center of my life. I stared back, unable to form a response, convinced I had misinterpreted the entire exchange. He was just making an offhand remark. He had to be. But the way he held my gaze, steady and searching, made my skin prickle with the terrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't interpreting anything wrong at all. "You don't need to answer that," Marcus said, noticing my sudden, uncomfortable stillness. He shifted back slightly in the chair, breaking the intensity, but the confession had already been made. He had seen something in me, something I worked hard to keep hidden behind practicality and routine. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, a gesture that looked distinctly unprofessional, distinctly human. I apologize. That was inappropriate. It's been a long week, and the rain always feels like an interruption I can't afford. It's okay, I whispered, though it wasn't. My mind was spinning, trying to categorize this interaction. Was this a test? Was he just naturally a boundary pusher? He looked toward the window again, but his focus was internal. People in my world, Eliza, they don't understand quiet. They mistake silence for compliance or indifference. Every conversation is a negotiation. Every gathering is a performance. He paused, and when he looked back at me, his eyes held a raw kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with the stock market. My job is built entirely on being present, being powerful, being certain. I haven't had a moment this entire year where I didn't feel like I was carrying an invisible, tremendous weight that I am not allowed to put down, he confessed, his voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain. Everyone expects a certain version of Marcus Hayes. Even at home, sometimes it's demanding. That word, demanding, hung in the air, heavy and loaded. He wasn't criticizing Professor Hayes, but he was certainly revealing the cracks beneath the gilded surface of their life. He wasn't talking about loneliness in a poetic sense. He was talking about the emotional toll of constant performance. He was the CEO, the powerful figure. But in this quiet room, stranded by the rain, he suddenly seemed like the most burdened person I knew. I found myself leaning forward slightly, forgetting my own discomfort in the face of his sudden, stark vulnerability. He wasn't the unapproachable titan anymore. He was just a man, profoundly tired, who needed to say something real to someone who wouldn't immediately leverage it against him. I understand that, I said softly, the words escaping before I could filter them. When people expect so much, sometimes the safest place to be is where no one is looking. He finally smiled, a slow, sad, genuine curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes, but softened the hard lines of his face. Exactly. And that's where I see you, on the edges. You seem ungoverned by expectation. In that moment, the asymmetry shifted. He still held the social power, the status, the wealth. But I held the emotional safety. He was admitting a deep, fundamental weakness to me, the invisible research assistant. He was the one taking the risk. And I realized that the distance I had always perceived between us might only exist on paper. We fell into a comfortable, easy silence, still separated by the expanse of the faculty lounge floor, but intimately connected by the unexpected honesty. The rain outside seemed to amplify the sense of being secluded. The world temporarily paused just for us. He reached for the lukewarm coffee I had poured earlier, taking a slow sip. He grimaced slightly at the taste, but didn't complain. This is atrocious. Did you actually drink this? It was for warmth, I defended, a small, genuine laugh escaping me. It felt good to laugh in this room, especially with him. It achieves its purpose if you lower your standards significantly. He placed the cup down, his eyes still holding that residual weariness. I haven't lowered my standards in 20 years. Maybe I should. We started talking, not about my work or his, but about things entirely unrelated to the university structure that bound us. We talked about the peculiar silence of old buildings during a storm, the strange satisfaction of finishing a complicated task, and the necessity of having one perfectly ordinary habit. Mine was reading paperback mysteries before bed. His was watching old, black-and-white war documentaries. He spoke about the pressure of always having to be the one who knows the answer, the one who solves the problem. I spoke about the unique freedom of being the one who doesn't matter, the one who can observe everything without being observed in return. "You have a very careful way of seeing things, Eliza," he remarked. He was studying the way I held my hands in my lap. "You notice the things everyone else misses." "I'm trained to look for details in archives," I murmured. "It's a habit." "No," he contradicted, his voice firm but gentle. "It's how you protect yourself. You observe the environment before you step into it." I felt a dizzying surge of panic and exhilaration. He saw me. Not the invisible assistant, but me. The conversation drifted naturally, unforced, punctuated by the rhythmic pounding of the rain. There was no seduction, no flirtation, nothing that could be reported or categorized as inappropriate. Only the raw, exposed connection of two people who recognized the burden of pretense in each other. At one point, he gestured toward my briefcase. "What were you delivering? Something crucial, I assume." "Just budget projections," I said. "Dry stuff. Important, but dry." He nodded, running a thumb along the smooth leather of the chair arm. "Dry is good. My world is often volatile. I forget what quiet certainty feels like." I met his gaze, and for a long moment, the world outside, the university, his wife, my job, vanished. It was just Marcus, his guarded honesty, and me, feeling less invisible than I had in years. The air was thick with unspoken truths, but also with an unfamiliar, profound comfort. We weren't trying to achieve anything. We were just being in the same space, letting the clock run down. The rain didn't stop, but it did soften slightly, morphing from a downpour into a steady, persistent drizzle. The change in tempo broke the deep spell of our conversation. Suddenly, the external world was threatening to return. My internal alarm bells, which had been blissfully silent during our exchange, started ringing loudly. I was sitting here, in the faculty lounge, alone, talking intimately with my professor's husband, a man who held a significant influence over the institution that employed me. The ethical line wasn't just blurred. It felt like I was standing directly on it, balancing precariously. I looked at Marcus, and the reality of the situation hit me with cold clarity. This man was completely unattainable. He was a fixture in a life that was stable, respected, and seemingly perfect. Whatever fleeting connection we had shared in the last half hour was dangerous and unsustainable. Even the knowledge that he felt burdened, that he saw me, was a secret I needed to bury deep and fast. I shifted in my seat, placing my coffee cup firmly on the side table. My hands were starting to feel clammy. "The rain seems to be easing a bit," I noted, my voice sounding strained and overly bright. I was trying to signal the end of the truce, the return to normal protocols. Marcus sensed my withdrawal instantly. The weariness in his eyes intensified, replaced momentarily by a flash of regret, or perhaps understanding. He knew exactly what I was doing. "Are you planning to brave it?" he asked, but it wasn't a question about the weather. "I have to," I insisted, standing up, needing the physical action to reinforce my emotional boundary. "I have things I need to prepare for tomorrow. Paperwork." The lie felt thin, but necessary. I had nothing urgent waiting at home, but a sad container of leftover pasta salad. But I needed distance. I needed the safety of my predictable routine back. This was too much, too soon, too fraught with potential consequences. What if Sandra had seen us? What if Professor Hayes walked in? The thought of being misunderstood, of having my professional reputation tainted by this accidental intimacy, made my stomach clench. I clutched my briefcase tight. I was willing to sacrifice the few moments of feeling truly seen, if it meant protecting the carefully constructed security of my ordinary life. Emotional risk had always felt too expensive. It was... "Good talking to you, Mr. Hayes," I managed, forcing professional neutrality into my tone. He stood too, and for a moment, he simply towered over me, silent. He didn't move toward me or away. He just stood there, letting the tension coil between us. I could feel my resolution wavering under the sheer weight of his attention. I wanted to turn and flee, to dissolve back into the university background. I needed him to let me go, but he seemed rooted to the spot, refusing to allow the moment to simply become a forgotten coincidence. He was waiting for something, and I dreaded what it might be. I took a half step towards the door, mentally calculating the distance to freedom. That's when Marcus moved. He didn't touch me, but he moved just enough to block the exit to the main part of the lounge, his eyes fixed on mine with an alarming intensity. The professional facade I had tried to erect crumbled under his scrutiny. He didn't speak immediately. He just watched the frantic nervousness flickering across my face, the fear of consequence, the desire to retreat. He allowed me to feel the full weight of the silence, knowing I was waiting for the apology, the retraction, the polite return to normal. When he spoke, his voice was low, cutting through the residual noise of the rain outside like a scalpel. It wasn't the voice of the tired man who needed an ear. It was the voice of the man who knew exactly what he wanted and was prepared to name it. "You're trying to turn this back into nothing," he stated, a simple fact. "You're trying to convince yourself that this was just two strangers, stuck by a coincidence, exchanging banalities." My mouth was dry. It was a conversation, Mr. Hayes. We were waiting for the rain to stop. He shook his head slowly, deliberately. "No, I told you. I've been watching you. I see how you walk, how you read, how you try not to be noticed. I see how deeply you hide your life, how much you value being completely unknown. And yet, here you are, the first person I've spoken to in months who didn't want something from me. You just offered honesty." He took one more step closer, a distance that felt monumental in the small room. My breath hitched. I could smell the fresh rain on his trench coat, mixing with the subtle warm spice of his cologne. "Eliza, I don't need more business partners, and I certainly don't need a distraction. I don't need another polished, carefully curated version of a relationship," he articulated, the words precise and devastating. He lowered his gaze slightly, meeting my eyes in an act of pure, unfiltered recognition. "What I need," he finished, his voice barely a rough whisper, "is the quiet certainty that you offer. I need the person who doesn't expect anything from me. And I need you to know that I see you, Eliza Hayes. I don't just observe you. I see your kindness, your intelligence, the genuine light you're trying to keep hidden. And I want to know what it feels like to be near that light." He held out his hand, palm up, not reaching for me, but offering the choice. "I know all the reasons why we shouldn't be talking like this. I know what risks I'm asking you to consider, because they are the same ones I am terrified of taking. But tell me to forget this now, and I will. Tell me you want me to stop seeing you, and I'll walk away." The power structure dissolved completely. He had given me the choice, placed the terrifying risk directly in my hands. He wasn't demanding anything. He was admitting his profound, secret need for me. My heart was hammering so loudly in my chest, I was certain he could hear it over the quiet whir of the air conditioning. My mind, usually so methodical, was a complete blank. "Tell me to forget this now, and I will." He was offering me the escape route, the chance to reclaim my safe, predictable life. All I had to do was say no. I looked at his outstretched hand, then back up at his face. His expression was serious, devoid of manipulation, radiating an almost heartbreaking vulnerability. He wasn't tempting me with luxury or power. He was offering me the one thing I secretly craved, to be truly seen. My own defenses, built up over years of quiet self-protection, felt like sand crumbling under pressure. I wasn't brave. I wasn't confident enough to think I deserved this kind of recognition. But I was honest enough to admit the crushing fear of turning away from something so real. My voice came out strained, barely a whisper. I'm scared, Marcus. This is impossible. I work here. Your wife is my professor. I didn't try to intellectualize the conflict. I stated the terrifying realities. He held my gaze steady. I know the context. I'm asking if the risk of that context is greater than the feeling we're sharing now. I looked away for a moment, down at my shoes, then back at him. My whole life had been about managing risk, choosing the path of least resistance. But for the first time, the safest path felt suffocating. If I said no, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what it felt like to step toward the light he claimed to see in me. I would return to my quiet apartment and the low expectations. But now, the quiet would feel like a defeat. I don't know what this means, I admitted, my eyes stinging. I don't know what we would do or say or where this goes. I don't want to hurt anyone. He gave a slight, patient shake of his head. You don't have to know any of that, Eliza. You only have to decide if you want to stop running. I took a shaky breath. I wasn't choosing a future. I was choosing a moment. I was choosing not to deny the genuine connection that had bloomed in the shelter of a storm. Instead of taking his hand, I simply lowered my own. A small affirmative gesture. I can't tell you to stop seeing me, I confessed, the words heavier and truer than any passionate declaration. I don't want you to stop. A wave of profound relief washed over his face, so intense it was nearly palpable. The hard lines of the CEO softened completely, replaced by something warm and grateful. He didn't move to kiss me or embrace me. Instead, he acknowledged my emotional surrender with a profound nod. The moment of intensity broke, replaced by a delicate, almost nervous energy. Marcus stepped back, allowing me access to the door again. But the dynamic between us had fundamentally changed. The rain had softened further, now just a mist settling over the campus. It's safe to leave now, he observed. His voice returned to its natural, measured tone, yet carrying a new undercurrent of shared intimacy. I took a breath, the air in the lounge suddenly feeling too thick. I need to go. He simply nodded. He retrieved his trench coat from the chair, slung it back over his shoulder, and walked toward the exit of the administrative building with me, matching his long stride to my quicker, nervous steps. We didn't speak again until we reached the main lobby, which was now empty and quiet. We stood just inside the glass doors, watching the last vestiges of the storm vanish into the gray evening. The campus lights were flickering on, casting long, wet reflections across the slick pavement. I won't push you, Eliza, he said, looking at the street. I know what you need, but I also know what I need. I won't disappear just because the rain stopped. I could only look at the ground, my head reeling from the abrupt transition back to the real world. I was walking out of this building into a life that was now irrevocably different, even if outwardly nothing had changed. He reached out slowly, his fingers just brushing the back of my hand, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt up my arm. He pulled away immediately, respecting the space I needed. Walk home safely, he instructed, his eyes finally meeting mine, holding a promise that felt far bigger than a simple goodnight. I'll see you when I see you, and I promise I will always see you. I managed a weak, almost imperceptible nod. I pushed through the glass doors, stepping out into the cool, damp air. I didn't look back, but every nerve ending in my body was aware of his presence behind me. I walked quickly down the street, my practical shoes barely making a sound on the wet sidewalk. I was heading home to my predictable life, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing someone powerful had willingly exposed his weakness to me and had asked for my light, burned hotter than any insecurity. The fear was still there, a constant hum. But now, it was accompanied by a thrilling, terrifying sense of beginning. The rules had been broken, not by impulse or recklessness, but by a startling mutual recognition. I was no longer invisible, and the thought was the most dangerous and exhilarating thing in the world. If you loved the silent tension of this connection and want to see if Eliza can navigate the impossible territory of her professor's forbidden love, hit that like button and subscribe. The story of what happens next, the secret meetings, the late-night texts, and the shocking moment Professor Hayes finds out, is waiting for you in the next chapter. Don't miss out on seeing how far they are willing to risk everything for a love they never expected.